Today on Prophecy Focus, we will examine the sixth of the seventh Jewish feasts in Leviticus 23 and its prophetic nexus. I'm Dr. Richard Schmidt, founder of Prophecy Focus Ministries and pastor at Union Grove Baptist Church in Union Grove, Wisconsin.
I'm Pastor John, discipleship pastor at Brookside Baptist Church in Brookfield, Wisconsin.
Well, John, as always, we've got another absolutely amazing program, I believe, that we're going to be sharing. We're going into the sixth of the seven Jewish feasts, which is known as the Day of Atonement, the most sacred holy day of the entire year in the Jewish calendar.
It is, and this matters. We're dealing with sins being atoned for. An absolute incredible truth in the Old Testament and in the New Testament.
Absolutely. Well, folks, as we open up the Word of God and examine, and as we like to say, peel God's prophetic word, one passage at a time, we're going to be looking at this very, very important day. We've talked a little bit about it in our past program as to when we were looking at the previous feast, or the Feast of Trumpets. As a little reminder, I'm holding in my hand a shofar, or a ram's horn. We're looking at now the last three feasts in the book of Leviticus chapter 23. And we talked about the Feast of Trumpets, which really was not like the modern day trumpets, the brass and the silver ones that we're used to, but actually the ram's horn would be cut off of the ram, and this would be turned into a literal trumpet. It can make a lot of noise if you know how to play it right, and it does get people's attention. But we're going to move on from that. We'll do just a very quick review of that start of the fall feast. So we've gone through the 4 spring feasts, and now we're into the last 3 fall feasts as we begin to go through the 7 feasts altogether. So we've got a summary going.
I love this, studying the festivals, because it points us back to the person and work of Christ, and it makes you appreciate what God has done to save us.
Absolutely. Every single thing has a nexus to prophecy. Again, on Prophecy Focus, we don't just study the Old Testament and leave it alone and then don't bring out the prophetic nexus. It's so important to see how the whole Word of God fits together, Genesis to Revelation, how God opened up passages in the New Testament that may not have included all of the information in the Old Testament. So it's amazing how God expands upon what happened under the Jewish regime, if you will, and now how it's expanded under the church age, and then again into what we'll call the future with Israel.
Yeah, it really covers all of Israel's past, present, and future. It's really stunning. All
right, well, let's go to what we're going to look at as the 2 Jewish high holy days. Better known in the Hebrew words of Rosh Hashanah, or the Feast of Trumpets, or the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. These are a very, very important feast. We need to understand what the Day of Atonement, what happened on the Day of Atonement back in the mid-1400 BC, when God implemented this very important feast, and how it would develop into the first temple period after the Jewish people came from Egypt, went to, if you will, Mount Sinai, where the law was given and these instructions were given, where a tabernacle, or a movable, if you will, in our vernacular church, but a movable temple was built, and then how it finally morphed into the first Jewish temple and was implemented in 960 AD with the various furniture items. So we're going to go down, we're going to take a look at the start of the Feast of Trumpets. And again, the dating is somewhat debated. The oldest date that's looked at is 1491. I think John and I are more on the page of 1445 when this was implemented. But we want to see how the Feast of Trumpets, then that first fall feast, then morphs into the Day of Atonement. So John, again, and I know we both have Jewish friends and some Orthodox friends, and after this wonderful celebration, they have 10 days of really serious introspection to look at their position Am I in a right relationship with God?
Yeah, and with the history of what we know from the scriptures about the Day of Atonement, this 10th day of the month of Tishri was a significant day for Israel because all their sins would be atoned for, and the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies once a year. And that's a scary time because what if the high priest dies? What if God rejects them? So there's a sense of helplessness that they're coming before the Lord pleading, please forgive me.
Absolutely. Now, folks, this is interesting. When John made the statement, what if the high priest dies? When we go and we start examining the Day of Atonement, we'll find out that only one person, the high priest, could enter into what's known as the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the sins of Israel. The interesting thing is, and John, to my knowledge in history, it's never been recorded that the high priest died when he went into the Holy of Holies. Might have, but it's definitely not recorded to my knowledge at least.
Yeah, I think I've heard some legends where they tie a rope around one of the feet so that should he drop dead because he wasn't clean in some way, that they could pull the corpse out of there. But again, I've never heard, we have no scriptural examples. The closest we have is when one of the kings of Israel, I forgot what his name was, he rushed in and tried to offer the incense of offering and then became leprous. But he was able to be walked out for the rest of his life. He was a leper. That's the closest we've come to anyone having any consequences in there.
Right, so it appears, at least from history, and again, slight speculation, but it appears from history that every time the Day of Atonement was done, and it's one time, once a year, when the Day of Atonement would take place, that the high priest would go in and, to our knowledge, always was successful, if you will, in applying the incense, applying the blood, which we'll talk about in just a moment, as they atoned or covered the sins of all people. So let's look at the last feast before the Day of Atonement was Rosh Hashanah, also known as the Feast of Trumpets. So on the Feast of Trumpets, it was a great time, a great celebration, because now the harvest had come in, and now it was time for the people to do Thanksgiving. And the very next day, it was time to go into this time of, if you will, very sincere fasting and introspection and waiting upon as the high priest would indeed enter the Holy of Holies. So last program we talked a little bit about the 10 days of awe, which is what the Jewish people call the gap between the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement. Again, a major time to be introspective as they prepare for what we're now going to look at, which is Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. So John, let's go to Leviticus chapter 16, and we'll start looking at some of the scriptures and how this is going to play out.
Yeah, this is an amazing passage. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, your brother, is this the right one, 6:2?
Yes.
Not to come at just any time into the holy place inside the veil. So that's the Holy of Holies. Before the mercy seat, which is on the ark, lest he die. For I will appear in the cloud above the mercy seat.
All right, so we're starting, if you will, the rules of engagement to meet with the holy God. And in Leviticus 16, which obviously is before Leviticus 23, some of the rules are already being set. So God is making it clear, listen, you are not to go past that veil, if you will, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant sits. Now, there's so much history on the Ark of the Covenant, we could spend hours literally just talking about the Ark of the Covenant, its significance in biblical times. But the Ark of the Covenant, after the first temple was built, was placed behind what is known as the veil, and it was the most holy place in God's tabernacle and in his temple, which would be the subsequent building after the tabernacle. So, and we have a little bit of a picture that kind of depicts that. So the high priest would stand outside the Holy of Holies. He would have his incense ready to bring in, and he would also have blood, which we'll talk about in a moment, that he will bring into the Holy of Holies and start a very specific set of rituals, if you will, God's commandments, in order to properly atone for the Day of Atonement. And it comes down even, John, to the very specific attire that the high priest was to wear. So if we go to Leviticus 16:4, it tells us about that attire.
Yeah, he shall put the holy linen tunic and the linen trousers on his body. He shall be girded with a linen sash, and with the linen turban he shall be attired. These are the holy garments, and therefore he shall wash his body in water and put them on.
You know, it's very interesting when we look at the attire. It's very specific. But I want to point out at the end of verse 4 about he's to wash himself. The concept back in the Old Testament times, there were what was known as mikvahs. They would walk down into this, if you will, symbolic cleansing place. It is exactly the same concept that we practice now with water baptism. It's a cleansing. It's showing symbolically the cleansing that is to take place on the high priest's body before he's going to come into the presence of the Lord. Now, the washing didn't save the priest. It simply was a ritual, if you will, or a ritual's maybe a bad word, but it was a command of God for the high priest to be clean. Why do we practice? And I think this is a good time to bring this up. It has a little practical application. In most of our Christian churches, we practice what's called baptism by immersion. There are some churches that do what we'll call sprinkling. Some churches will pour, but we, at least in our churches, our Baptist line and many Bible churches practice baptism by immersion. Here's what the word means, and John, you can bring in your comments on this. What it means is the word baptizo, the Greek word, means to be placed into. In other words, when we baptize somebody, it doesn't save them. It is a symbolic time where the Christian, an adult Christian or a child who has been able to make a profession of faith in Jesus Christ, says, I want to be baptized. Why? Because it's an outward profession of the inward conversion. And when a person comes, in our church, I think Brookside as well, we give a testimony. They tell us about when they trusted Jesus Christ. Then they, if you will, go into the waters of baptism as an outward sign of what God did in their heart. Baptism doesn't save them, but it certainly is a great symbolic picture.
You know, there's a real small little story on this word baptizo, because it is a big question. Is it sprinkling? Is it pouring? Or is it immersion? And I don't know if you knew this one, but they found this text from a Greek poet, and a physician, Nicander, who lived in 200 BC. It was a recipe for making pickles. And it's helpful because he uses both words. And listen to this. Nicander says that in order to make a pickle, the vegetable should first be dipped, bapto, into the boiling water, and then baptized, baptizo, in the vinegar solution. Both verbs concern the immersing of vegetables in a solution. So from that historical document, we know that they said baptizo, they meant immersion. Cool story. It all comes down to the pickle.
John, you just blew me away. I'd never heard that story before, and I agree with the conclusion, but it's a very interesting way to get to it. So very good. All right, well, let's move back to, let's get out of pickle land and go to Bible land. But that was great. Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 5 says, And he shall take from the congregation of the children of Israel 2 kids of the goats of a sin offering, and 1 ram as a burnt offering. Now this is all in preparation for the Day of Atonement. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his house. So God said before, and boy, I mean, we could talk forever application on this. Does God expect his Christian leaders, his pastors, his deacons, his elders, if you will, does he expect cleanliness and proper living out of us?
Absolutely. 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1 are the requirements for the elder of the church, the elder pastor. And when they sin, they are to be publicly rebuked. This is a big deal. This is why Paul, confronting the hypocrisy of Peter, he did it publicly. Yeah. This God holds, James 3:1, stricter judgment for the teacher. It matters.
It does. And folks, we're held to a high standard. Well, let's go to another major event that takes place during the Day of Atonement. John, have you ever heard of the term, he's a scapegoat?
Yes.
And where did it come from? Well, it came right here from Leviticus chapter 16, verses 7 and 8. John, why don't you take this?
He shall take 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of the meeting. Then Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for the scapegoat.
Now what are we talking about here? This is a very interesting scenario that God is bringing to the table, if you will. He's talking about 2 goats. They cast their lots. Unfortunately, the one goat that got the one lot, he's going to die real soon. And he's going to actually be a sacrifice to help shed the blood, if you will, that will be eventually used at the mercy seat or inside that Holy of Holies. The other goat, and we have a little bit of a picture that you might be seeing, we have the 2 goats. So the lot is cast. The one goat is literally going to be set free. He's going to be let out into the wilderness because, and we'll look at the passage. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 16. And John, why don't you take this again, verses 9 and 10, kind of tell us about this.
And Aaron shall bring the goat on which the Lord's lot fell and offer it as a sin offering. That one dies. But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement upon it and to let it go as the scapegoat into the wilderness.
So John, what is your position then? What is the scapegoat doing? Why does he get let free? Why does he get sent back to the wilderness?
Well, if I remember, don't they lay hands on that goat?
They do.
And when they lay hands on that goat, they're imputing the sins on that one?
They are.
Boy, oh boy, I'd be a little worried if that goat came back.
Yeah, very so. So what happens? Well, folks, what God is trying to point out here is the priests lay their hands on the goat. They confess the sins of the people. The sins are figuratively, symbolically placed on the goat. God makes it very clear that there should be no sin in the camp. So therefore, this goat is said, get out of here, go away, get the sin out of the camp. Now, I've heard many good messages on this from many preachers over the years and about having sin in the camp. In other words, is there sin in your life? Is there sin in your home? Is there sin in your local church? Those things need to be like the scapegoat, cast it out. Get it out of our lives. Get it out of our Christian churches and so forth. So it has a really nice application, if you will. But God is making a picture, which he often does, of symbolizing things that need to take place in the life of God's people. And the scapegoat is the one that is literally cast out into the wilderness, runs away. I've heard some people will say, well, what's the chance of his survival out there? It doesn't really matter. God doesn't put an emphasis on it, but the sin's got to go away.
But there's also another picture here, and that is the sin on this goat is dealt with outside the camp. And there's a connection in Hebrews that actually describes that.
Yes.
In fact, Hebrews 13:10 through 14, we have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate.
Absolutely. Great biblical fulfillment of what God talked about way back in the Jewish feast. Well, let's move forward and go to Leviticus chapter 16. We're now going to prepare for the high priest to enter into the Holy of Holies, which happens once a year. Leviticus 16:12. Then here the high priest shall take a censer full of burning coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and his hand full of sweet incense, beaten fine, and bring it inside the veil. So he has this very specific incense which the high priest is going to bring in as a sweet aroma to God. And he shall put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat that is on the testimony. And here it is again, lest he die. So we have a Jewish rendition of, artist rendition of basically what's taking place here. So we saw the high priest standing on the outside of the Holy of Holies in what was known as the holy place. That's the first major chamber before the Holy of Holies. He then walks through that beautiful tapestry, if you will, that veil, and now enters into what you're looking at, which is the Ark of the Covenant. And John, there's so much about the Ark of the Covenant, and it talks about the mercy seat. First thing that comes to my mind incorrectly is that this is like a throne that somebody's going to sit on. Is that what the mercy seat is?
Well, it's where I believe God shows up. That's where he dwells in the presence of Israel, in this tent of the tabernacle, later the temple. And I think this incense is there to veil a little bit, even God with the high priest being there. And but that's where God is. That's where he's meeting man. It's, in a sense, almost back to the garden, so to speak, where God and man are together. But it's only this one day. They're in this one event.
There you go. So the mercy seat, actually, if you look at the picture, you'll see two cherubim, two angels that are facing each other. Their wings basically would be touching according to the scriptures. They sit on top of, basically it's a rectangular box. Inside the Ark of the Covenant was Aaron's rod, the Ten Commandments, manna, that was it. But it was there, it was symbolic. And again, no one was to touch that Ark of the Covenant. It was basically could result in death. But the high priest comes in where this Ark of the Covenant was placed about 960 BC. That Ark remained there until 586 BC. The Ark then, quite frankly, it disappeared after that. And it's never been found, never been recovered. There's much speculation on where the Ark is today. Most conservative scholars believe the Ark is somewhere down in the catacombs way underneath the Temple Mount. Nobody's been able to prove it yet. I've heard some that say, well, we believe it's in X place, but quite frankly, I've heard the stories, I've heard the interviews, and I find them a little suspect. So it's really hard to tell. But John, the high priest, enters in, and in Leviticus 16:14, here is the actual atonement, if you take it from there.
Yeah, he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the mercy seat on the east side. And before the mercy seat, he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. And you can't get away from this beautiful picture. What's going on in the tabernacle, there are some amazing similarities with Isaiah when he comes and describes in the Holy of Holies, where it says, Holy, holy, holy is Lord God Almighty. And then also in the book of Revelation, you have this altar, you have the mercy seat. There's some really interesting pictures here that gives us a little glimpse that we later see in Revelation.
All right. Well, let's take a look at 1 or 2 more verses in Leviticus, and then we need to jump ahead to how Christ fulfilled the Day of Atonement. Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people, bring its blood inside the veil, do with that blood as he did with the blood of the bull, and sprinkle it on the mercy seat before the mercy seat. Why? Because God is covering the sin of the Jewish people. Now we're going to jump ahead to Leviticus 16:34, and it says, this shall be an everlasting statute for you to make atonement for the children of Israel for all their sins once a year. Now, John, you had brought up Hebrews. If you wouldn't mind, Hebrews 9, we'll start at verse 12 and tie this into how Christ fulfilled this.
Yeah, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood. He, Jesus, entered the most holy place once for all. And by the way, 7 times in the Bible does it describe this as a once for all act. Having obtained eternal redemption, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit, that's the Holy Spirit, offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God.
All right, so we have an absolute fulfillment that took place with the Day of Atonement when Jesus Christ came to once for all, just didn't cover sin, he paid for sin and annihilated it to all who will trust in him. Well, I want to go very quickly, and this again, we're looking at a future prophetic concept, and I'm going to pull up a slide here. Again, a little bit of speculation here, but if Jesus Christ fulfills the fall feast in the same day order as he did the spring feast, Here's a rendition of what could happen. So as we look on our chart, we see the Feast of Trumpets being the literal second advent, or the return of Jesus Christ to this earth. The rapture of the church takes place when Jesus comes in the air. Don't believe that that is literally corresponding to the Feast of Trumpets, though many do. Could be a time when Christ returns, but he could return on any date at any time. But if the Feast of Trumpets, which I lean towards, takes place on the literal second coming of Christ, there will then be his coming. There'll be the 10 days of preparation for what? The Day of Atonement then would correspond with when the nations are judged and spoken about in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46, the sheep and the goat judgment, which must happen after the tribulation period. So we have the judgment taking place. Does that prophetically, specifically apply to the Day of Atonement? I certainly, John, I lean in that direction, but again, God doesn't specifically line these things up, so there's a little bit of prophetic a license, if you will, on this.
Yeah, and just to bring some other views in here, some look at Zechariah 12:10. I will pour out on the house of David, on the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me whom they pierced. Yes, they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. And the question is, when is this? Is the Day of Atonement, let's say the 3.5-year mark, where the abomination of desolation now exposes, Israel is now needs to flee. They've been hearing the preaching of 2 witnesses. So that's another question on timing again.
All right, well, folks, this has been a very interesting discussion. Again, you've heard a couple of different views on this. Again, my leaning is that the day of, if you will, the Feast of Trumpets is when the second coming happens. 10 days of preparation for the Day of Atonement, which will be the judgment of the nations, Matthew 25, 31 to 46. There'll be another 5-day gap, and then we're going to come into what's known as the Feast of Tabernacles, which you must come back next time to Prophecy Focus to see. Well, let's end on this verse. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 12, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, he, Jesus Christ, entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. My friend, have you placed your faith and trust in Jesus Christ? Well, God bless you. Thank you so much for watching Prophecy Focus.